Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Jen Curtis podcast. I am going to talk today about fluctuations, what they are, what to expect, why they happen, and what you can do about it. Fluctuations is probably the single thing that most drives people crazy when they're dieting. And it's probably the thing that I talk most about with my clients. I probably spend most of my time calming people down over fluctuations. And people often need to hear the same thing week after week. They'll say things like, I know we had this conversation last week, but my weight's just jumped up. Why? What could it be? Why did it happen? I'm kind of freaking out about it. It's also probably one of the questions that I get most from you guys on Instagram. And I've had a couple of requests to just do a podcast about it and explain what's going on. So let's dive into it. The first thing to say before we dive into the reasons is that fluctuations are inevitable. Even if you really control your diet, eat exactly the same thing every day, your weight will still fluctuate from day to day. So it's so important when you're on a fat loss journey to buckle up and get comfortable with the fact that the scale is going to go up and down. It isn't going to just go down in a straight line. And even if you're maintaining your weight, it doesn't just stay the same every day. And the second really important thing to say is that fluctuations on the scale are not indications of changes in body fat. The fluctuations are much more to do with things like water, undigested food, and inflammation. And the thing is that you've got all of these tissues in your body, right, that weigh something, right? Everything weighs something. So you've got all of your organs, you've got all your blood, you've got your bones, you've got your connective tissue, you've got your brain. All of these things weigh something, and they aren't changing very much. If you've never strength trained and you start strength training really seriously, you are going to see very small changes in things like bone density. So your bones might get heavier, but they aren't changing. All of those things in your body aren't changing on a day-to-day or week-to-week or month-to-month basis. Then you have muscle mass, which you can change more reliably. You can build muscle mass quite reliably, but it's still a very, very, very slow process. So you're only going to see slight changes in body weight due to muscle mass over a period of months. Then you've got body fat. And body fat, if you are in a calorie deficit consistently, the body fat's going to be reducing on a fairly consistent basis, and you're going to see changes from week to week. And then you have all those other things that I mentioned before: undigested food in your digestive tract, water, and inflammation, and also poo, which I guess also comes under the umbrella of undigested food, that are fluctuating on a day-to-day basis. They just don't stay the same on a day-to-day basis. All of them are going up and down. So your weight and your fluctuations on a day-to-day basis are very much dependent on all of those things. But the big takeaway is that if over a weekend your weight jumps up by 2 kilos or 5 pounds, it is not fat gain. Now, if you ate like an absolute pig for 2 days straight, 5,000 calories a day, some of that might be fat gain. But if you just kind of ate a little bit more than usual, that jump up in weight is not going to be indicative of fat. It's going to be much more indicative of undigested food, water, and it's going to come off just as fast as it went on. So let's talk about the reasons why your weight might fluctuate. So first of all, simply more food, right? If you get on the scale, like everyone instinctively knows this, right? If you get on the scale and weigh yourself first thing in the morning, then you get off the scale, eat a massive meal and drink 2 liters of water and get back on the scale, you're going to weigh like at least 2.5 kilos more, right? Like that makes sense to us, right? Because that all of that food and water is now in your body. And the same is true if you have a big meal the night before. Some of that, you're going to have much more. If you have a much bigger meal than what you usually have, you're going to have the next morning more undigested food and water in your digestive tract. Now, also the opposite is true. So when people start a diet, so when people start on my program, for example, and they get into a calorie deficit over the first week, that if they're doing it right and they manage to get into a calorie deficit very reliably right from day one, they drop a lot of weight very, very quickly. And that's because they've reduced their food intake. So there's, over the course of a week, there's less and less undigested food and water in their digestive tract. So while they might have lost, say, I don't know, half a kilo, 300 grams of fat over the course of that week, they might have dropped a kilo or two in undigested food and water, simply because their food intake over the course of the whole week has gone down. So especially when you're consistently in a calorie deficit, if then you suddenly have a big meal, the weight's going to jump up a lot the next day, because you've had your digestive tract has been quite empty, like comparatively, and then all of a sudden it's very, very full. So it's really important to be okay with, if I had a big meal the night before, my weight's going to jump up the next morning. It's not a big deal. If I just get back in my calorie deficit, it's going to come back down. Second reason, more carbohydrates. So if you think about pouring, if I poured a liter of water on a table, there's a big puddle of water, and then I took a piece of bread and I put the bread in it, what's going to happen? The bread's going to soak up all of that water. If I took that same puddle of water and I put a chicken breast in the middle of it, it's not going to soak up any water, is it? So this makes sense to us. It's like the carbs are like a sponge, but they also act that way in our body. So when you eat more carbs, let's say in general, you're eating a certain amount of carbs. Most of my clients are not eating a low carb diet, but they might be reducing them slightly. And then one day, all of a sudden, one evening, you have like a really, really, really carby meal. The next morning, your weight might jump up because the carbs have soaked up a lot of water. This is also the reason why when people go on a low carb diet, they drop a lot of weight really quickly, because in addition to what I said previously, where just by reducing your overall food intake, your weight's going to go down because there's less undigested food and water in your digestive tract. If you also go on a low carb diet, you also lose a lot more water because of that. So sometimes a lot of people are really addicted to that beginning part of a low carb diet because they might suddenly drop like 2 or 3 kilos. But then that once you've gotten rid of that, excess water, the weight loss doesn't keep going in the same way. It might only be half a kilo a week or less if you're in a calorie deficit. So that's why a lot of people really love that initial rush of a low carb diet, but they don't continue to get those results. Reason number 3 is more salt. You have a saltier meal the night before, your weight's likely to go up the next day, again, because of water retention. Reason number 4, a hard workout. So if you are really, really, really sore the next day, you had a really great session, you lifted really heavy weights, you went up in all your lifts. The next day, you're super duper sore. The soreness is a sign of inflammation in your muscles. That's not a bad thing. That is part of the healing process, right? So you lift weights, you cause tissue damage, muscle tissue damage, among other things. And then your body has to fix that. That's the inflammation. And that can cause a sudden spike in weight. And I've seen people go up a kilo or more from one day to the next just because they're very, very, very sore. And it's also true that if you are doing strength training regularly and you always have sort of mild DOMS or a little bit of muscle soreness, your weight's going to be slightly elevated due to inflammation that you have in the muscles all the time. And then if you suddenly have a week off, you might find that your weight suddenly drops down a kilo, but like more than it otherwise would. And then when you go back to lifting heavy weights again, that kilo comes back on. So that's just inflammation in the muscles, and you have to take that into account, right? You have to factor it in. Also, for women, PMS, premenstrually, you might be you might be retaining more water, you might be more bloated. If for any reason you're more bloated, that will also weigh something, right? If you feel big and puffy and you've got a bigger stomach, like that, whatever's causing that, which is normally water retention, is going to weigh something, right? So if you're feeling really bloated and you've noticed that your weight's up this week, like, don't freak out. That weight change is likely due to being bloated, and not because of fat gain. Also, hydration status, if you're very dehydrated, if you've gone on a really long run in the heat, you might weigh less the next day. If you just run a marathon, and I've had a client who ran a marathon and then the next day he was down like 5 pounds. And this is due to hydration status. People also notice, like just a little anecdote, sometimes if you eat completely normally and you also have a glass of wine and you don't usually have alcohol in the evening, you might find that your weight drops quite a bit the next day. And that's often due to a little bit of dehydration from having a bit of alcohol. So this is the thing, right? If you are in a calorie deficit consistently over the course of many weeks, your weight is going to come down. There's going to be a trend coming down over time, but the weight is going to be it's not going to be coming down in a linear fashion. It's going to be going up and down. Okay. And I've got this is just a podcast, so I can't show you this visual, but I've got this great line chart from one of my clients who lost 50 pounds, and 50 pounds is a lot of weight, right? And over like the course of about 9 months, she lost these 50 pounds. But if you zoom in to any one particular part it's a really clear trend down, but if you zoom into different parts of the line, it's this squiggly line going up and down. And there's lots of points where you can see that her weight's gone up and she's gotten a little bit stuck, a bit high, and then it drops down again. And it creates this really beautiful trend that looks quite linear over the course of many, many months. But the reality on the ground of her day-to-day experience when we were working together and she was losing weight is that sometimes her weight was up and sometimes it was down, and sometimes it went up a bit more and it got kind of stuck there and the fluctuations were a bit higher. So it's really, really, really important to be, if you're on a fat loss journey, whether you want to lose 5 pounds or 50 pounds, to be looking at that trend over time, because you will notice trends over time and not get caught up in the daily fluctuations. Because I can't tell you how many people sort of, they start a diet, the weight starts coming down, mainly because of less undigested food and water in their digestive tract, but also probably because they're losing a bit of fat as well. And then it goes really well for say like 2 weeks. And then they have a day where they overdo it. They just kind of like go a bit off the rails. They just feel like having a bit more to eat. There's like delicious food. They're at a social gathering. And then they get on the scale the next day and their weight's up by a few pounds. And they're like, oh God, I've ruined everything. And then they give up, right? So they've lost weight over two weeks. They've lost body fat over 2 weeks. Over that one day where they slipped up and they ate way too much, they haven't actually gained any body fat. They've just gained undigested food and water. And if they just get back on track the next day and carry on, the weight will come down as quickly as it went on. And then they will continue losing body fat if they stay in a calorie deficit. And I've had clients that I've worked with for months and they've lost loads and loads and loads of weight, but they've fucked up or slipped up on like many, many, many occasions, and the weight goes up on the next day. This is totally normal, but people's tendency is to freak out and then give up because I've just gained 3 pounds, I've ruined it all. And the reality is that you haven't ruined everything. You've just gained some undigested food and water. And if you get back in a calorie deficit, it's going to come off again. You haven't undone. A lot of people sort of are like, oh, it took me 2 weeks to lose that weight, and then I gained it all in one day. No, you just gained water weight. You just gained undigested food, and it will come back off. You didn't gain back all the fat that you lost in 2 weeks. People get very, very, very crazy about this. So I call this fuckititis, and I compare it to, if you had a flat tire, what would you do? Would you go and fix the tire, or would you slash your other 3 tires and be like, oh, well, my car's fucked anyway, so I might as well just ruin the rest of the car? This is what you're doing when you freak out over a fluctuation up, and then you just throw the baby out with the bathwater and throw it all in the bin. And just stopping yourself from getting fuckititis and staying calm about the weight fluctuations up and down, and just keep going, doing the things that work, you will get to where you want to go, even if you have fluctuations up on many, many, many occasions. Okay, so what can you do about it to minimize fluctuations? Like I said, you can't get rid of them completely, but you can minimize them. And the first thing that I recommend is to weigh yourself. The only time you ever weigh yourself should be first thing in the morning, before eating or drinking anything, after doing a wee, and without any clothes on. And I know that's a lot of criteria. And, if you've got a newborn or if you've got lots of kids, it can be really hard to do that. But you want to get it as close to those conditions as possible. Not because it's going to eradicate all fluctuations, but because it's going to minimize them, okay? So something that some people do is they weigh themselves later in the day. And this is completely fucking stupid because, like I said, the example that I gave before, if you eat a big pile of food and drink 2 liters of water, you're obviously going to weigh 2 kilos more, right? Your weight later on in the day after you've eaten and drunk things is going to be affected because you're going to have that food inside you that is going to be weighing something. If you stood on the scale and then I gave you a plate of food and 2 liter bottle of water, it would weigh more, right? So the same is true here. So you have to weigh yourself first thing in the morning as much as possible to get rid of most of those fluctuations, to have as kind of steady a reading as you possibly can. And another thing you don't want to do is if you weigh yourself first thing in the morning and then go for a run, don't weigh yourself again afterwards. This is such a silly thing to do. You should never be weighing yourself after that first window of opportunity in the morning. The second thing you can do, and this is probably one of my more controversial pieces of advice, is that you should weigh yourself every single day, right? Obviously, it's fine to skip a day, but when you weigh yourself every single day, you can do a couple of things. You get, instead of getting just one number a week, you get lots of data points, and then you can see a few different things. You can see the highest number, you can see the lowest number, you can see the average number, right? But you can see fluctuations from day to day. A lot of people advise just weighing yourself once a week. And a lot of people come to me sort of with this idea that you should weigh yourself just once a week. But consider this. Let's say you decide to weigh yourself every Sunday morning, and you weigh yourself Sunday morning, first day of the diet, and your weight is kind of lower than it was the day before, just randomly, just because of undigested food and water or whatever. Then your weight kind of goes up a bit again before it goes down. And then you weigh yourself at the end of the week. And let's say you've seen it's gone up and then it's gone down lower than what you saw on Sunday by Thursday. And then the next Sunday, it's higher than it was on the first Sunday. You're going to get this false impression that you've gained weight. But if you looked across the whole week at the average and at the lowest number, you'd see that you had actually lost weight, and then the weight, let's say you had more to eat Saturday night, so Sunday morning your weight was up. If you only compare once a week, it's just so arbitrary. You're only getting if you weigh on a specific day, you have no way of knowing if your weight is going to be up or down, higher than usual, lower than usual, or average on that particular day. And it can give you a really false idea of whether or not you've lost weight. I've also heard, once somebody said to me that they heard that you should weigh yourself on the same day of every month. So the first of the month, every single month. This is even worse. It's just such an arbitrary thing. If you're taking data points every single day, right, then you can look for the lowest number each week, the highest number each week, the average number each week. But if you're just taking it every first of the month or every Sunday, then that's just such an arbitrary data point to be comparing to the previous data point, because it could be an average one week and then a high number the next week and then a low number the next week, and it gives you a completely wonky view of what's happening over the course of the whole week. So you want to have as many data points as possible, and my recommendation is to weigh yourself every single morning or as often as possible, first thing in the morning, to get as many data points as possible. And then the third kind of tip, and I kind of already alluded to this, is then you want to look at two things. You want to look at the average and you want to look at the lowest weight each week. And I actually focus most on the lowest weight each week. Why? Because one, it's just the most concrete. You can just see if your lowest weight is going down on a weekly basis. There's something much, much, much more concrete about that. But there's also something more motivating about it, just taking the lowest number each week. But you should also be looking at the average as well, because there might be weeks where the lowest number doesn't go down, but the average comes down significantly. That's also a move in the right direction. So those are the two things that I focus on with my clients, and you need more data points to be able to get that. The fourth piece of advice is to start to see these like weigh-ins as data, and you want to try to detach yourself emotionally from the number on the scale. So it's really important to sort of see it as feedback. So see, like, it's giving you feedback as to whether or not what you're doing is working, and you need to be patient with this, right? And something that I do with a lot of my clients is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and getting them to not, because what most people do is they catastrophize and spiral over, like if they have a weight that goes up, they catastrophize so much about it. And then if they have a weight that goes down, they tend to dismiss it. So they have this kind of negative filter where they dismiss all of the positives. They dismiss any evidence that shows that things are going well, and they tend to exaggerate on the negatives. And this is not, we don't want to go too far the other way either and convince yourself that, that everything's fine when you're clearly not losing weight. But we have to see things clearly in the middle. And it's really important to foster like this practice of being as objective as possible, as neutral as possible, and seeing it as feedback. Rather than getting too caught up emotionally with the number on the scale. If, for example, you've seen over a couple of weeks that your weight isn't going down, that the average is staying the same, the lowest number staying the same, that maybe it's fluctuating, but there's no real trend down, you don't want to sort of get all upset about it and be like, oh, well, there's no point. All of this effort that I'm making isn't doing anything. You want to see it as feedback that you might not be in a calorie deficit. You might be missing certain things out, and you want to, you then, if it's not working, you might need to tweak things to be able to get in the right direction. And you need to, in order to do that, you need to have a sense of objectivity and neutrality about the data points that you're seeing, and not get too caught up in them, because the getting too caught up in them and spiraling and catastrophizing, it doesn't help. It causes a lot of, just mental strain, but it also causes you to get fuckititis and then just give everything up. But it's also really important to not go too far the other way and convince yourself that you're doing everything that you need to do when the numbers are not supporting that. So I've heard of people who have been, quote unquote, in a calorie deficit or trying to lose fat for a number of months, and their body weight hasn't come down at all. And yet what they tell themselves and what they tell me is that, yeah, I've been on this fat loss diet for 6 months or for 4 months. I've been losing fat, even though the weight hasn't been coming down. And if this is the case, you are just lying to yourself. You're kidding yourself the other way. Like you're sort of convincing yourself that you have been losing weight, even though for the past sort of few months, you've just been in a maintenance diet. And then often I get the question, like, how long should you wait to see if you're getting, to see if the weight's coming down? Like, how long do you wait? Like, do you persevere? Because, again, people can persevere for months and not get any weight loss whatsoever. And this obviously leads to just frustration and giving up. And my answer is, like, what I do with my clients is, especially the first 2 weeks, I look at the numbers very, very closely. I ask them to report their calories. I ask them to report their weight. And I expect to be seeing in the first 2 weeks signs of a trend downwards. Now, it could just be fluctuations, and sometimes you've got something that looks like a nice clear trend down in the first 2 weeks, but you still have to say, yeah, okay, like, it looks like it's working right now, but we need more data. But in the first 2 weeks, you should be seeing a new low number each week and a new average number coming down each week. And if it's not, and this has happened several times with clients, is that they sort of report all the right numbers and they seem really happy with what they're doing, but there's no sign of a trend downwards in the first 2 weeks. It just looks like they're maintaining their weight. And it's really important for me to step in at that point and say, look, I know you feel good about the changes that you're making, but we're clearly not in a calorie deficit here. We're not moving in the right direction, and we want to start to tweak things. Normally, we look at how they're tracking, and if there's anything that they're not tracking, and if there's anything that they're skipping, or anything that they're just eyeballing and guesstimating, that we can tighten up, because it's normally on the level of tracking that it's going wrong. And we need to sort of tweak things to make sure that they are reliably in a calorie deficit and we start seeing those numbers go down. So certainly within the first 2-3 weeks, we want to see the numbers going down. And within that first month, we want to identify exactly what the formula is, like what that person needs to do in order to continue to see their weight coming down really reliably. So it's really, really, really important that you don't spiral over fluctuations up. But on the other hand, it's really important that you don't just convince yourself for months and months on end that you're doing all the things that you need to do and that you're losing fat and it's okay. It doesn't always show up on the scale, because it will, if you are in a calorie deficit, it will show up in like the first couple of weeks, and certainly by the end of a month you'll have a clear trend downwards. So that's it. That's like the topic of fluctuations. Just to summarize, fluctuations are inevitable. There's lots of reasons why the weight will fluctuate up. It's okay. Just keep going. Get back on track the next day. Keep doing the things that you need to do. Don't be overly emotional about the scale. Don't spiral because of it, but also don't be too complacent about it either. The scale weight is not a direct indication of body fat gain or loss, but it is in general a good indication over a period of time. And you want to be looking for trends over time rather than focusing too much on those fluctuations up and down on a daily basis. Let me know if you have any questions about fluctuations, and let me know what you thought of this podcast.